The scream wasn't rage, it was something breaking. The alien warship eased into docking ring C like a shadow swallowing light, its hull stretching nearly 300 feet of seamless obsidian alloy, humming at a frequency too low for most human ears to register, but strong enough to rattle the loose bolts in Ethan Walker's maintenance cart. Red warning strobes washed the corridor in pulsing color as station personnel froze mid-step, coffee cups trembling in their hands. Because everyone on Arcadia Station had heard stories about Commander Lyra Vale and the way her voice could carry across vacuum through sheer force of will. And then the airlock opened with a slow hydraulic sigh, and the scream tore through the docking bay. Sharp, layered, almost harmonic, warping the thin aluminum guardrails and driving grown men and women to one knee under the pressure of it. 40 feet above the deck, balanced on a steel ladder with a wrench tucked into his back pocket. Ethan didn't react at first because his noise-canceling headphones were sealed tight over his ears, and Springsteen was playing low and steady while he tightened a stubborn thermal valve that had been leaking coolant at 2 ounces per minute. He felt the vibration before he understood it, a shudder running through the rungs into his boots, a tremor like distant thunder rolling under concrete. And when gravity shifted without warning, artificial, deliberate, his body lifted gently but firmly off the ladder and pinned against the cool bulkhead, as if the station itself had decided to hold him still. Below him, guards lay braced against the deck, palms flat, eyes wide, while at the center of the bay she stood, taller than any human by half a foot, skin luminous blue with a faint violet undertone that caught the emergency lights like oil on water, uniform woven from metallic fibers that moved as if alive, her dark eyes blazing not with cruelty, but with something hotter and far more fragile. Ethan's wrench clattered down, striking the deck with a bright metallic ring that echoed up the walls, and only then did he slide one headphone off his ear, blinking as the last vibration of her scream faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. She turned toward him slowly, gravity still holding him suspended 4 feet above the floor, and for a long second they just stared at each other, her chest rising and falling in controlled, measured breaths, his fingers flexing against invisible force. Around them, the docking bay lights flickered back to white, revealing the fine cracks in the nearest pane of reinforced glass and the thin curl of steam rising from an overheated conduit. Ethan swallowed, not out of fear, but from the dryness in his throat, and in a voice steady enough to check a circuit breaker he said, "Is it grief?" The word hung there, small and human, drifting across 30 feet of steel and silence, and something in her expression shifted, not weaker, not softer, just startled, as if no one in her empire had ever mistaken her fury for pain. Gravity did not release him immediately. It loosened by inches, as if the station itself was reconsidering its decision, and Ethan felt his boots brush the deck before the invisible pressure finally dissolved, leaving a faint tingling in his arms like static after pulling off a wool sweater. No one else spoke, no one else moved, because the question he had asked still hovered in the docking bay, small and impossible. And Commander Lyra Vale stood at its center with her jaw set and her hands slowly unclenching at her sides. Up close, he could see the fine lattice of light beneath her blue skin, faint bioluminescent currents that pulsed in uneven rhythm, not wild now, but strained, like an engine idling too high. A thin fracture traced across the reinforced viewport behind her, catching the white light in a delicate web, and beyond it the curve of Earth hung 12,000 miles below, serene and indifferent. She stepped toward him, boots striking the deck with measured precision, each step exactly 18 inches apart, disciplined even in distress, and the air between them carried the metallic scent of overheated circuitry. "You presume much, human," she said, her voice no longer amplified by fury but controlled, low, carrying across the bay without effort. Ethan bent to retrieve his fallen wrench, turning it once in his hand before sliding it into his belt as if this were any other maintenance call, and he shrugged in a way that would have looked careless if not for the steadiness in his eyes. "On my planet," he answered. "When someone sounds like that, it is usually because something is gone that cannot be repaired." A murmur rippled through the station crew, quickly swallowed by silence. Lyra's gaze flicked past him to the viewport, to the fragile blue sphere turning slowly in the dark, and for a fraction of a second the light beneath her skin dimmed. "Nothing is beyond repair," she replied. But the words carried the faintest hesitation, like a system buffering before response. Ethan noticed the tremor, small as it was, because he had spent 10 years listening to machines on the verge of failure, and he knew the sound of strain disguised as strength. He took one careful step closer, closing the distance to less than 6 feet, close enough to see a thin line of silver at her temple where her uniform collar had pressed too tight. "If that were true," he said quietly, "you would not be shaking." Her eyes sharpened at that, and the gravity in the room shifted again, not crushing this time, but heavy with attention. Around them, the docking bay lights stabilized, returning to a steady white glow, and the hum of the station's life support resumed its steady 70 decibels, ordinary and human. Lyra drew a slow breath, measured to the second, and for the first time since the airlock had opened, she did not look like a commander addressing a lesser species. She looked like someone calculating the cost of an order already given. "You mistake intensity for instability," she said, but the bioluminescent currents beneath her skin flickered unevenly again, betraying her. Ethan did not smile, did not challenge her authority. He simply met her gaze and held it, not in defiance, but in recognition, as if he had just identified the real malfunction in a system everyone else was too intimidated to inspect. The docking bay felt smaller now, as if the steel walls had leaned in to listen. Commander Lyra Vale did not step back, but she did not advance either, and that pause carried more weight than her earlier display of power. Ethan could hear the station clearly again, the steady rotation cycle humming through the deck plates, the distant click of cooling metal, the soft ventilation current brushing past his collar at a constant 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Ordinary sounds, grounding sounds. Lyra's gaze shifted past him toward the viewport once more, toward Earth suspended in black silence, its oceans bright against the void, and the bioluminescent patterns beneath her skin flickered in a rhythm that no longer matched her controlled breathing. "You analyze what you do not understand," she said, her tone precise, measured to the syllable. Ethan rested his hands loosely at his sides, palms open, the universal gesture of someone holding no weapon, no argument. "I repair things for a living," he replied, voice even. "If something vibrates off pattern, I notice." A faint pulse moved along the line of her jaw, a ripple of light that traveled downward and disappeared beneath the collar of her uniform. Around them, the station crew remained still, uncertain whether to witness or retreat. Lyra tilted her head slightly, studying him as if recalibrating an equation. "You believe my state is malfunction," she said. It was not accusation. It was assessment. Ethan shook his head once. "No," he answered softly. "I think it is overload." The words settled differently. Not failure, not weakness. Overload implied capacity exceeded, strength pushed too far. For the first time since she had entered the bay, her shoulders lowered by a fraction of an inch, small enough that most would miss it. Ethan did not. "Your species assigns emotional value to operational outcomes," she said. "In my civilization, outcomes are evaluated by survival metrics." Her eyes remained steady, but the light beneath her skin dimmed again at the edges. Ethan followed her gaze to Earth. "Survival is not the same as living with what you chose," he said. The ventilation hum seemed louder in the silence that followed. Somewhere behind him, a loose panel ticked as it cooled. Lyra's attention sharpened. "You assume I chose," she said. The words were level, yet something beneath them thinned. Ethan inhaled slowly, the air tasting faintly of ozone. "If you did not choose, you would not be shaking." This time she did not deny it. The gravity in the room remained neutral, but the tension shifted from threat to gravity of a different kind, the weight of something unsaid. Lyra stepped closer until only 4 feet separated them, close enough that he could see faint hairline fractures in the metallic fibers of her uniform near her wrist, stress lines where fabric had been gripped too tightly. 12 standard hours ago," she said, eyes fixed beyond him. "I authorized a strategic containment measure." The phrase was clinical. The light beneath her skin was not. It flickered unevenly, like a power grid under strain. "Containment," Ethan repeated quietly, not as challenge, but as confirmation. She nodded once. "Precise." It ensured stability across 3 systems. Her voice did not rise. It narrowed. Ethan did not ask for numbers, did not ask for consequences. He simply stood there, a maintenance technician 40 feet from his ladder, listening as if she were describing a faulty reactor core. And stability, he said carefully, cost you something. The docking bay seemed to hold its breath. Lyra's gaze finally returned to his, and for a fleeting second the commander disappeared, replaced by someone calculating not empires but memory. It cost, she said, and the faintest tremor crossed the light beneath her skin. More than the metrics recorded, and in that admission, quiet and precise. The scream from earlier no longer sounded like anger at all, but like the echo of a decision too heavy for even her species to carry alone. The words did not echo, but they settled into the steel like weight added to an already strained beam. Ethan did not rush to fill the silence, because he had learned that when a system was overheating, the worst thing you could do was force more energy through it. The docking bay lights held steady at full brightness now, clean white against polished alloy, and through the viewport Earth rotated in slow indifference, blue and whole and impossibly distant from whatever decision had just been. Described in careful, bloodless language, Lyra Vale stood 4 feet away, shoulders squared by habit rather than ease, the faint bioluminescent currents beneath her skin moving in irregular pulses that betrayed the cost of composure. More than the metrics recorded, she had said, and the phrase lingered between them like condensation in cold air. Ethan rubbed his thumb against a thin smear of coolant drying on his knuckles, grounding himself in something physical and ordinary. On our station, he said quietly, when the numbers say everything is stable but the vibration keeps climbing, we shut the system down and look closer. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in calculation. Your species can afford hesitation, she replied. My command cannot. The faint hum of the life support system seemed louder in that moment, steady at its regulated pressure, proof that balance was possible. Ethan glanced toward the ladder he had been standing on minutes earlier, still leaning against the bulkhead, a reminder that he was just a maintenance technician in grease-stained boots, not a diplomat, not a soldier. It is not hesitation, he said. It is maintenance. The word sounded small compared to empires, yet it carried its own gravity. Lyra's gaze followed his for a brief second, taking in the ladder, the scattered tools, the thin crack in the viewport that maintenance would eventually seal. Maintenance implies preservation, she said. Some structures must be removed to preserve the whole. Her tone was steady again, commander precise, but the light beneath. Her skin dimmed along her forearms as if the current had met resistance. Ethan stepped to the side and picked up his fallen wrench from where it had skidded across the deck earlier, turning it once in his hand before offering it to her, not as a weapon but as an object, cool metal resting across his open palms. This station stays together because someone tightens what starts to loosen, he said, not because we pretend it never shifted. She looked down at the wrench as if it were an artifact from a simpler civilization. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her hand and allowed her fingers to brush the steel. The contact was brief, but the bioluminescent flicker beneath her skin softened, evening out by a fraction. Around them, the crew began to breathe again, subtle movements returning, shoulders lifting, hands lowering from defensive positions. Lyra withdrew her hand, yet she did not retreat. You speak as if guilt is a structural component, she said. Ethan nodded once. It is, he answered. It keeps us from repeating the same fracture. The station remained intact, the viewport still holding despite its thin web of cracks, Earth still turning 12,000 miles below. Lyra lifted her chin slightly, authority reassembling around her like armor, but something beneath it had shifted alignment. If what I authorized was necessary, she said, voice lower now, then why does your word describe it so accurately? Ethan met her gaze without challenge. Because necessary does not mean weightless. And in the quiet that followed, the commander who had arrived wrapped in controlled fury stood very still, as if feeling for the first time the full mass of what she had been carrying, and considering, perhaps, whether it could be shared. For a long moment neither of them moved, as if the docking bay itself were waiting for a verdict. The wrench still rested in Ethan's open palm, its weight familiar, ordinary, measured in ounces rather than empires. and Commander Lyra Vale studied it, as though it were a foreign instrument designed to recalibrate something inside her. Beyond the viewport, Earth continued its slow rotation. Clouds drifting across blue oceans that knew nothing of strategic containment measures or survival metrics. The crack in the reinforced glass caught the light again, thin but visible, a reminder that pressure always left a mark. Lyra drew a controlled breath, shoulders squared, yet the bioluminescent currents beneath her skin no longer flared erratically, instead settling into a steadier rhythm that almost matched the 72 beats per minute pulse Ethan could feel in his own wrist. "You suggest the weight can be shared," she said, her tone precise but no longer sharpened for defense. Ethan lowered the wrench and clipped it back to his belt, the small metallic click sounding louder than it should have. "Not shared across systems," he answered quietly, "just acknowledged by someone who will not use it against you." Around them, a few crew members slowly returned to their stations, movements cautious but less fearful, the docking bay lights now constant and calm. Lyra glanced at them, then back at him, calculating variables no console could display. "In my command," she said, "admission of burden is interpreted as instability." Ethan gave a slight nod. "On Earth, pretending you are fine when you are not is what breaks people." The ventilation current brushed past them again, steady and cool, carrying the faint scent of lubricant and warmed alloy. Lyra stepped closer, reducing the space between them to barely 3 feet, close enough that Ethan could see faint lines at the edge of her eyes, not age but strain. "If I allowed this burden to be seen," she asked, "what would your species do?" The question was not rhetorical. It was almost cautious. Ethan considered it the way he would consider a failing circuit, tracing the path before answering. "Some would judge," he said honestly. "Some would not understand. But some would stand next to you and say you are still worthy of command." The word worthy seemed to settle differently than the others. Lyra's posture shifted by a fraction, as if an internal brace had loosened. She turned slightly toward the viewport, her reflection faint in the cracked glass, blue skin against the curve of Earth. "In my civilization," she said slowly, "worth is measured by outcomes alone." Ethan followed her gaze. "Then your civilization is efficient," he replied. "But it sounds lonely." Silence expanded between them, not hostile now, but contemplative. The hum of life support filled the space where anger had been. Lyra did not respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her hand and placed her palm lightly against the reinforced glass. Fingers splayed over the thin fracture line. The bioluminescent light beneath her skin glowed. Softly, no longer flickering, simply present. "Your planet appears fragile from here," she murmured. Ethan allowed himself the smallest smile. "It is," he said. "That is why we try so hard to take care of it, and each other." She looked at him then, truly looked, not as a subordinate species or a strategic partner, but as a single human standing without armor or rank, and for the first time since her arrival. There was no gravity field holding him in place, no raised voice, no calculated command, only a quiet recognition that strength did not always roar, and that sometimes the bravest act in a docking bay 12,000 miles above Earth was simply to admit that something necessary could still hurt. Commander Lyra Vale kept her hand against the cracked viewport for several seconds longer than necessary, as if measuring the resilience of the material beneath her palm, and Ethan remained beside her without speaking, aware that sometimes presence was more stabilizing than advice. The docking bay had returned to operational rhythm, technicians moving in controlled patterns, consoles glowing steady blue, the temperature holding at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the air between them felt altered, thinner in tension but heavier in meaning. Lyra withdrew her hand slowly and studied the faint fracture line her earlier outburst had left behind, tracing it with her eyes the way a strategist studies a fault line on a planetary map. "Your station will require repair," she said. Ethan nodded once. "Everything does, eventually." He stepped toward a nearby control panel and keyed in a diagnostic request, the screen responding with a soft chime as structural integrity percentages scrolled upward in calm green numbers. "It is holding," he added. "Cracks look worse than they are when you catch them early." Lyra observed the display with focused attention, absorbing the data, but her gaze drifted back to the glass rather than the numbers. In my command, she said, voice quieter now. Fractures are concealed until they threaten collapse. Ethan leaned one shoulder lightly against the console, grease smudged along the fabric of his sleeve. On Earth, we put tape over them, label them, and schedule maintenance before they spread. The faintest curve touched the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but something close. Your species accepts imperfection openly, she noted. We do not. Ethan considered that. Maybe that is why we survive it. A soft alert tone pulsed from a distant terminal, not urgent, simply informational, and the crew resumed ordinary tasks with cautious glances toward the two figures near the viewport. Lyra turned fully toward him now, the bioluminescent patterns beneath her skin flowing in smoother, synchronized waves. If I were to acknowledge this burden within my ranks, she said, my authority would be evaluated. Ethan met her gaze steadily. Authority that cannot withstand truth is already unstable. The words were not confrontational. They were delivered the way he would report a pressure reading. Lyra absorbed them in silence. Outside, Earth's sunlight shifted along the curve of the planet, casting a faint glow across her features and softening the angular lines of her command uniform. You speak as though stability is built from vulnerability, she said. Ethan pushed off the console and stood upright again, hands relaxed at his sides. It is built from trust, he answered, and trust does not grow in perfect silence. The docking bay hummed steadily around them, a structure of bolts and beams and human hands that required constant care. Lyra's gaze drifted once more to the thin fracture in the glass. She lifted her hand again, not to test it this time, but simply to rest her palm against the cool surface. The light beneath her skin glowed evenly now, no longer flashing in sharp, irregular bursts. Your planet appears fragile, she repeated softly. Ethan stepped to stand beside her, shoulder to shoulder, both of them looking out at the blue curve suspended in endless dark. It is, he said. That is why we fix what cracks, and we admit when something hurts before it shatters. For a long moment neither spoke. The station rotated in measured silence, 12,000 miles above the world that had taught him that strength did not mean unfeeling, and beside him, a commander who had arrived wrapped in fury stood very still, as if considering for the first time that maintenance might apply not only to stations and ships, but to the heart that commanded them. The first warning came as a tremor beneath their feet, subtle but wrong, a vibration that did not match the station's steady rotation. Ethan felt it before the alarms registered, a low oscillation traveling through the deck plates and into his boots, and his eyes shifted automatically to the nearest structural readout panel. The green integrity lines flickered once, then again, dipping by 2% before stabilizing. Around them, technicians paused mid-task, hands hovering over controls. Commander Lyra Vale straightened instantly, every trace of private reflection folding back into disciplined awareness. Yet the light beneath her skin did not flare with anger this time. It sharpened. Report, she said, voice calm but carrying across the bay without amplification. A navigation officer swallowed and answered. External gravitational distortion detected at 200 yards off the port side. Magnitude rising. Ethan moved to the console beside the viewport, fingers flying across the interface as he pulled up external telemetry. Outside, space appeared unchanged, black and endless. Earth turning peacefully below, but the numbers told a different story. Micro fluctuations rippled along the station's outer hull, small but escalating. That is not natural drift, Ethan murmured. Lyra stepped beside him, shoulder nearly brushing his, eyes scanning the data streams faster than most humans could read. A field generator, she concluded quietly. Localized, controlled. The docking bay lights dimmed for half a second as the station compensated for the pull, then brightened again. Somewhere deeper within the structure, a metal beam groaned under shifting load. Ethan felt it in his chest like a second heartbeat. If the stress keeps climbing, that crack in the viewport is going to widen, he said. Lyra's gaze flicked to the thin fracture line in the glass, then back to the telemetry. Her jaw tightened, not in rage but in calculation. My vessel can disengage and avoid the distortion, she said. The statement hung there. Ethan knew what it meant. Her ship was not physically connected to the station's structural frame. She could pull away, shield herself, preserve her command. Below them, Earth continued its silent rotation, unaware of the tension 12,000 miles above. Ethan shook his head slightly, eyes still on the data. If you disengage abruptly, the shift in mass distribution could increase the strain on docking ring C by another 4%. He did not look at her when he said it. He did not need to. The choice was clear in the numbers. Lyra's bioluminescent patterns brightened along her arms, not chaotic, but intense. She was running scenarios, calculating probabilities of structural compromise, crew survival, fleet readiness. The station shuddered again, stronger this time, enough to send a loose wrench skittering across the floor. Several crew members grabbed onto railings, breath shallow but controlled. Your people are vulnerable, she said, eyes fixed on the scrolling metrics. Ethan finally turned to face her. Yes, he answered simply. We are. Another tremor passed through the deck, and the crack in the viewport extended by less than an inch, a faint ticking sound marking its progress. Lyra watched it with sharp focus. This was the moment where empires chose themselves first. Her ship's engines were already cycling to standby, awaiting command. She closed her eyes for one measured second, as if feeling the full weight of gravity not from the distortion field, but from the decision pressing down on her chest. When she opened them, the light beneath her skin burned steady and clear, canceled disengagement. She ordered into her wrist console, reinforced docking ring C with my vessel stabilizers. The officer on her channel hesitated. She did not. Now, Ethan felt the shift almost immediately as the external strain decreased by a fraction of a percent. It was not dramatic, not heroic in the way stories like to portray such things, but it was enough. Lyra stood beside him, gaze steady on the data, choosing in that quiet instant not the safety of isolation, but the heavier path of shared risk. The stabilizers from Lyra's vessel engaged with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through docking ring C like a second spine locking into place, and the structural integrity display climbed slowly from 94% to 96%, then held. It was not safety, but it was breathing room. Ethan watched the numbers with narrowed focus, fingers moving across the console to reroute auxiliary power from non-essential sectors, dimming corridor lights by 5% to reduce strain on the grid. The station answered with a softer glow, shadows lengthening along the bay floor. Outside, the invisible distortion field pulsed again, bending starlight in subtle arcs, a ripple against the black field intensity increasing by 3%. A technician called out, voice tight but controlled. Lyra did not flinch. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the external telemetry as streams of alien script flowed across her wrist display. The bioluminescent patterns beneath her skin burned brighter now, not chaotic, but resolute, as if every current inside her had aligned toward a single decision. My vessel will transfer additional mass anchoring, she said. Evenly. It will limit our maneuverability. Ethan understood the cost immediately. Her ship would become an extension of the station's vulnerability. If the distortion spiked, both structures would absorb it. You could still detach, he said quietly, not as suggestion but as fact. The crack in the viewport ticked once more, extending another fraction of an inch. Earth's horizon shifted in the glass, blue against darkness. Lyra's gaze moved to the fracture, then to the planet beyond it. If I detach now, she replied, the stress differential will exceed your tolerance threshold. She did not say the rest. She did not need to. Ethan felt the next tremor roll through the deck, stronger, a deep vibration that rattled the loose bolts in his cart and sent a hollow echo through the bay. He steadied himself against the console, heart rate climbing but hands steady. We can vent minor compartments to reduce rotational load, he suggested. It will buy us seconds. Lyra nodded once. Do it. He keyed the command, and somewhere along the outer ring small sections depressurized in controlled sequence, reducing mass by a measurable margin. The integrity display inched upward another 0.5%. Small gains, earned the hard way. The distortion field pulsed again, then faltered, its frequency destabilizing as if meeting resistance it had not anticipated. Lyra's eyes narrowed. It is being remotely maintained, she said, but its output is weakening. Ethan exhaled slowly, sweat cooled along his spine beneath his uniform. Then we hold, he said. For nearly a full minute the station endured, metal beams flexing within design limits, stabilizers humming in synchronized resonance with the alien vessel. No one spoke. Even the usual background chatter fell away. It was a quiet kind of courage, measured in percentages and patience. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the distortion field flickered and collapsed, space beyond the viewport returning to clean, undistorted starlight. The structural integrity display climbed back to 98% and steadied. The hum beneath their feet softened to its normal rotation cycle. Ethan released the breath he had been holding. Lyra lowered her hands from behind her back, the glow beneath her skin dimming to a calm, even light. She did not look triumphant. She looked certain. Disengagement would have preserved my vessel, she said quietly, eyes still on Earth. But it would have fractured more than glass. Ethan glanced at the thin crack in the viewport, still visible but contained. Cracks can be sealed, he replied. Lyra turned to him then, meeting his gaze without rank or distance. And some decisions, she said, voice steady and unguarded, can be remade by the next one. In the quiet that followed, 12,000 miles above a fragile blue world, a commander who had once believed stability required silence chose instead to anchor herself to something imperfect, and the station held. The docking bay did not erupt in cheers when the distortion field collapsed. It exhaled. Technicians returned to their stations with quiet efficiency, fingers gliding across touch screens, confirming that structural integrity held at 98% and rising. The thin crack in the viewport remained, a silver thread against reinforced glass, but it no longer spread. Earth turned below them in patient silence, clouds drifting across oceans that had survived far worse than one unstable gravity well. Ethan powered down the auxiliary reroutes and watched the corridor lights return to full brightness, the station's hum settling into its familiar rhythm at a steady 72 decibels. Beside him, Commander Lyra Vale stood very still, her vessel's stabilizers disengaging with a soft, descending tone that vibrated through the deck before fading into quiet. The bioluminescent currents beneath her blue skin flowed evenly now, no erratic pulses, no sharp flares, just a calm internal light. She looked at the fracture in the glass one last time, then at her reflection layered over the curve of Earth, as if measuring who she had been when she arrived against who stood there now. Your station will require repair crews within the hour, she said, voice composed but no longer distant. Ethan gave a small nod. We will seal it, reinforce it, log it in maintenance records. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before adding, we do not erase cracks. We learn from them. Lyra turned to him, fully, and for the first time there was no invisible distance of rank in her posture. In my command, she said slowly, I was taught that authority must appear unburdened. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the place where her vessel had anchored itself to save a structure not her own. Today I allowed my fleet to witness my choice. Ethan met her eyes without triumph. And they are still here, he replied. A faint, almost imperceptible shift touched her expression, not a smile, not relief, but recognition. The docking bay doors cycled open in preparation for her departure, hydraulic seals whispering apart. Crew members stepped aside respectfully, not kneeling this time, simply watching. Lyra paused before crossing the threshold and looked back at the viewport where Earth shone blue against black. Your world is fragile, she said once more. Ethan moved to stand beside her, shoulder aligned with hers, both of them facing the planet suspended 12,000 miles below. So are we, he answered quietly. That is why we choose carefully what we protect. She studied him for a long moment, as if committing the equation to memory. You asked if it was grief, she said. It was. The admission carried no tremor now, only truth. Ethan inclined his head slightly. Grief means it mattered. Lyra absorbed that, then stepped through the airlock toward her vessel, posture straight, but lighter somehow, as if a portion of unseen mass had shifted from her shoulders to something shared. The docking bay sealed behind her with a muted thud, and the station resumed its ordinary orbit. Ethan remained by the viewport, eyes on the thin crack that would soon be patched, thinking of stabilizers and shared weight, and a commander who had chosen to anchor rather than withdraw. Outside, The stars reflected faintly in the glass, and for the first time that night, the silence between worlds did not feel like distance, but understanding.